So you guys can see him, right? So you can start whenever you ready to.
Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I open up as always with a prayer, supplication of sorts. If to basically ask Allah for clarity of thought. Had a long day in the office, one of those Fridays, where you get kind of slammed with a week's worth of the subject of this monthly long talk. And they were celebrating on television the soldier who had been caught sodomizing Palestinian prisoners. And I would like to say that when I watched that, I was shocked. But after what we've seen and we covered in the past month and what we're going to continue to cover, it shouldn't shock anyone. But just imagine and take yourself back for a second, us as Muslims and behaviors that we emulate from our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and how we strive to be in terms of the best of manners. And imagine not only being the guy that's famous for sodomizing a prisoner, but actually honoring that person, clapping when you see him. I mean, it's a level of sickness that is just not really able to be quantified or put into words. I mean, I was just, wow. You could become a celebrity in a country for committing homosexual acts of rape on another man as a man and be glorified and heralded in the media. They were taking this guy around the television shows and he's smiling and waving and people are wanting to get the picture and the selfies and all that good stuff with him. And I'm just sitting here like, am I living really in a reality, or is this, some sort of induced trauma or whatnot? But that's what we're dealing with. And as we've covered in these previous 4 weeks, going into part 5 now, I think everybody should expect this type of behavior at this point. It's just gotten really to the point of insanity. So we're going to recap a little bit where we've been. And as always, I ask anyone who has not watched the first 4 parts to please watch them, because you're really going to be lost. I mean, each week we go by, it gets even worse. In the last episode, we covered just a 1-year time frame. Today, we are going to cover basically even less than that, because the events during this period of 1947 to 1948 are so dramatic. So much of the landscape, geographically, culturally, literally, would change during this period of time. We'd have another one of these big moments, which we're going to get to next week. We go to 1967, as the borders just continue to shift and to change. One of the last things we talked about in the last bit of part 4 was the Pope Bernadotte assassination. This was the man who was trying to bring peace. He was trying to bring the sides together, to come together for an agreement, to cease basically hostilities and agree on some sort of a 2-state solution. And of course, the Zionists, led by the Stern Gang, executed him in public, along with a French diplomat. And there was no repercussions. We are going to see that theme again repeated today, that attacking dignitaries, attacking civilians, attacking diplomats, it doesn't matter to these people, because they're going to do whatever they want and there's going to be no repercussions. We see this today. How many resolutions from the UN these guys have violated? I can't tell you, I know off the top of my head, but it's quite a bit. And there's a list, it's a laundry list long, of how many resolutions this cartel has violated. And there's zero repercussions on them. Every single day, what they're doing now is completely illegal, but yet they're doing it again with impunity. And we saw it there. We saw it in part 3 and part 2, where they were attacking the British when they were controlling the mandate and trying to be peace, trying to blame these attacks on the Arabs. We explored the King David Hotel, where they dressed up like I'm dressed today. Basically, they tried to pose as Muslims and got access. They were waiters and kitchen help and caretakers, and they bombed the building. And they were going to blame it on those pesky, Arab terrorists, and they got caught. So we've seen again who's the one that is consistently doing this type of behavior in these engagements. That was the end of last week in part 4. We also got through something that was very key, in the end of part 4, which was basically where they introduced legislation called the Jurisdiction and Power Ordinance. That was where they stated from now and forever, any territory seized by this state, this Zionist state, would now be in their hands forever. It was non-negotiable. Those territories were not coming back. And it would not take them long to start acting on this, as we are going to see today in part 5, where it's now something they're still living by to this day, because that legislation was very clear: now, tomorrow, and forever. If we conquer it, we are not giving it back unless you come in and physically take it. So we had first 2 phases of this war that began in 1948. We saw in each one of these phases how the Israelis not only multiplied their troops, but they also, through deals with the West, through $128 million, which was a lot of money at that time, is equivalent of billions today, was pledged in a 1-year time period by the United States. This money, 67%, I believe, off the top of my head, was used to fund the Zionist war efforts, training, weaponry, and so on. We saw deals with Czechoslovakia. All nations of Western Europe were sending the Zionist arms. We saw no such support from the Palestinians, including from their so-called Arab brethren in the surrounding regions. So we talked about, particularly in phase 2, the Arabs wanted to hit it while the iron was hot. They tried to do everything they could to get as much as they could, because they knew the longer they were waiting, the more the war machine would have time to build. So we are going to cover today phase 3. We are going to cover the resolutions and the armistice agreements afterwards. And we are going to cover, ultimately, as we conclude today, the new land, casualties of the war, and Israel's official recognition as a member of the United Nations, and how they violated that within the first day that they were there by the terms they had agreed upon. And we are going to explore all that. So quite a bit of an action-packed session we have for you here today. So during the second phase of battle, the Israelis were unsuccessful in eliminating the presence of Arab militia. This was going on from the middle of the second phase all the way up into the third. The Arabs had set up, particularly in an area known as the Little Triangle. Here, resistance fighters would frequently target traffic from the road that led basically from Tel Aviv to Haifa. So this was something that the Arabs could do, which was the best in their ability at the time. Local militias fighting back, trying to become basically as much of a nuisance they could to Israelis able to move supplies, goods, and services. So this was a big, thing early on. It was a violation of the second period. But as I said before, after as many as these violated, if the Arabs if the Arabs didn't do something, they would have been in a situation here where it would have been much, much worse. The Israelis, however, as they always were prepared for this. They launched Operation Shooter with a goal in mind of resuming control of the roads. They would use their air power and also ground as well to strike on the 24th and 25th of July. Initially, they faced a stiff resistance. The Arabs put up a fight. These were trained fighters, militia members. They were not the typical civilians that the Israelis had been bullying around for the first year of the war, unarmed, untrained. These were actually trained fighters who were able to put up a pretty fierce defense. Heavy bombardments would go on. Israelis would capture the position. 3 additional villages were seized. Most civilians fled, before the fighting was over. 100 militiamen ultimately were killed. And again, we're seeing the air dominance, the artillery dominance. That's going to be very prominently featured today. We are going to see a lot of aspects of Israel's aerial dominance and how they own the skies, unprecedented within the next few months. There was nothing left to challenge them. Now, the Palestinians would make a claim that the Israelis had basically attacked Arab civilians. This was a claim that Israel would ultimately deny. The United Nations would do an investigation and find that there was really no evidence either way. It was their word versus their word. We're going to get over later as well in this session how Israel tries to hide their tracks from such crimes. So the United Nations didn't find anything. That's not saying there wasn't any. According to the Arab side, civilians were massacred in these village seizures. According to the Israelis, they were not. Israel will further launch more air assaults now, killing an additional 60 Arab soldiers within the area within these 2 days. So after the ground offensives, they were going out for any stragglers, any leftovers, and they would take, full control, as I mentioned, of the air. So after they had liberated this area for them, they would take full control of the roads, and both civilian and military travel was restored. all the Arab blockades were moved, and now from this point, the road was completely open. Reconnaissance missions had gone on with their air power, something the Arabs did not have the benefit of. Israel was able to determine pretty much that they had neutralized all threats, basically in the area. And that was something that was still going on in phase two, which I didn't have time to cover, just some of the guerrilla warfare aspects of this conflict. We get back to formal battles on October 15th to March 10th, 1949. This would be known as the third and final phase of the war. This would be some of the more bloodier fighting, but some of the more strategic fighting as Israel would seize the objectives they had been working and just inch by inch through the first two phases of the war. They would finally culminate during this third and final phase, which would redraw the borders as we know it. On October the 22nd, there would be a third truce that went into effect, but both the rogue Arab forces refused to acknowledge, as well basically as the Israelis. Both saw the iron being hot. Israel's perspective is we've got them on the run. We're breaking them down village by village, territory by territory. We're not stopping. And the Arab thing was if we wait, it's just going to be more dominance on their side, more supplies, more soldiers, more immigrants. There's really nothing we can do. We've got to fight now. So both sides broke the truce. They were on the same page here in terms of this, at least. Now, the Arab Liberation Army would attack an area known as Manara, and they would capture a strong point. This would be one of the final, you can say, Arab victories, in this conflict. But however, the Israeli IDF attempts to reclaim it would be in vain. They would ultimately lose 33 dead, 40 wounded, continuously trying to take this Manara region and failing. So it's one area the Arabs were able, again, to have a victory during all the middle of just loss after loss after loss. But Israel would counter. Operation Har Har on October the 24th, and during this, they would capture the entire area of Upper Galilee. They would take out an entire Syria battalion while suffering pretty much next to nothing in terms of casualties. 400 Arabs lie dead. After this, another 500 were taken prisoner. And of course, some of the Arab prisoners, as we've come to expect, would be executed. The numbers are not officially known, as the record keeping was not, as we're going to see later too with some of the other statistics, is not all the way accurate. But again, we see executing of prisoners, people who surrendered, going against international law, does not matter. We saw in the last session when the Arabs took the prisoners, they basically escorted them and they treated them as humanely as you could treat a prisoner. But we see on the other side, this just not being done. Following these captures and all the horror that was going on, it's estimated 50,000 Palestinians would end up fleeing to safety in Lebanon. So this is the beginning of what would be close to 750,000 Palestinians would move from the beginning of this conflict in May of 1948 all the way to the end in the following year. 750,000. Almost 70% of the population of British-mandated Palestine were civilians who had fled because they knew if you're not trained to fight, you're not going to be of much help. If your village is raided, your wife is probably going to be raped and tortured and killed. You are going to be raped, tortured, and killed. I mean, it was really, you cannot fault these people. A lot of people will say people fleeing war, especially men, they're cowards. But it's not being a coward if you know you have no chance. It's being intelligent. You live to fight another day. You safeguard your family, and that's what these men and women and families did. I mean, they knew if they stayed there, what was going to end up happening. It was not going to be a pretty sight. And they spared their families the indignities and the horror that ultimately would have remained had they stayed there. In a change of policy, however, the Arabs who remained peacefully during this stage were allowed to stay. So there were some, as we saw after these started beginning to flee, Israel kind of had their demographic shift numbers, and pressure from the international community did kind of pressure them to stop killing civilians, guys. I mean, please, it's try to at least conduct this war as civilized as possible. If you're going to seize the land, please, don't attack civilians or people who are non-combatants. So Israel did change the policy and stop doing this practice, at least on the surface level. However, it would not be the same for the Arabs of Igrit and Brim. They were promised by this Israeli government that they would be able to return to their homes after they were persuaded by the Israeli invading army to leave. So you had these Arabs in Ingrid and Barim. Okay, guys, evacuate your civilians. We've got a new stance here, a new pledge. We're not going to attack you. Just go, let us bombard the area, and we promise that you can come back. Well, change of fate here, however. Eventually, the Israelis would decide they weren't going to be allowing this. And they were so nice, I mean, of course, to do this after they told the people kindly evacuate, don't worry. But when they wanted to come back and return, no. Stop right there or we're going to shoot. You're not coming back in. Now, they did offer financial compensation, but very little. And financial compensation is not, you can't put a value on home, community, the land that your ancestors were raised in. You just cannot put a price on such things. Even if the offer was more lucrative, it's still disgusting because another promise was broken blatantly without any regard for consequence or any aspect of answering to God, of not wanting to commit sin or whatnot. There's no morality going on here. So by the conclusion of October, Israel would now seize all the territory in Galilee, and in addition to that, would go and take 13 total Lebanese villages. So we see, again, now this is the northern theater of the war. They're continuing to expand the territory north. Now, we talked about Negev in the last episode. This was the theater where you had a lot of intense fighting between the Egyptians and the Israelis. And we left off, the Israelis were starting to beat back the Egyptians, pretty much removed any Egyptian threats of having any kind of offensive campaigns anymore. They had been pretty much neutralized to trying to hold the land. So now they secured the north, they secured the road we talked about in the triangle. Now they were going to further secure the borders of the Jewish state in the south. The Israelis faced a dilemma, however. The West Bank, still not occupied by them fully today, had a sizable Arab population, which they were not prepared to absorb. Israel did not want to try to go in there, even though they felt they had the capabilities to win it. They didn't want to absorb all these Arab, populace into their state. They didn't want to have to deal with the management and the rioting and all kinds of problems that were undoubtedly going to transpire, because now you're being conquered for a second time, basically, and that would have caused a lot of issues. So what they wanted to put their attention to instead was the large area of Negev, which was mostly desert. So this provided lots of opportunity for them to expand and grow in an area that they didn't have to fight for. They could just basically get the Egyptians to remove, set up military outposts there, and they would ultimately control this land and gain a huge, sizable portion of the area that was mandated southern Palestine. So all their attention now, let's get those Egyptians, out. So they launched a series of military operations on these Egyptian forces. Beginning on October 15th, Operation Yoav was launched with the goal of driving a wedge between the Egyptian forces in northern Negev. They felt pressure to act quickly because talks were underway in the international community to hand over Negev to Egypt and Jordan. Jordan would get the eastern side, Egypt would take the southern side. So Ben Gurion, living up to their legislation, wanted to capture this territory before the arrangements could take place. Because remember that I talked about we'd be coming back to this time and time again. They already have their legislation in place in their government that they're not giving territories back. So they were we got to get this done. Let's take care of it, or they're going to divide it among the Jordanians and the Egyptians, because it was part of mandated Palestine. It was never part of the two-state solution. It was never part of any arrangements for the Zionists to give them that piece of land. So Operation Yoav had to come to get this land as quickly as possible. And it was a huge success. Unfortunately, the IDF would break the Egyptian lines. Egypt had very little reinforcements, damaged supply chains, were not able really to reinforce. As I mentioned in the last part, it was their last day in the sun. They wouldn't have any more victories. It was just pretty much being hold after the Israelis really showed them their air strength. Nothing to stop the IDF at this point. Egyptian army would vacate Negev, Beersheba, Ashdod, and the IDF just had an open road to claim the territory. Now, there would still be the Fallujah pocket, which would be surrounded by the Israelis. The Egyptian forces would actually valiantly hold this area for 4 months until basically the armistice agreement, which we will talk about later, of 1949 had been signed. The village would be peacefully transferred after that armistice agreement from Egyptian to Israel. And a further example of Israel's approach to war, warships bombarded the coastal installation to prevent the Navy of Egypt from evacuating. So even when they have basically an armistice agreement, the village is peacefully being evacuated, Egyptians are being transferred basically after this, evacuated out. They were going to go by sea. What does Israel do? They destroy the Navy so that the Egyptians are not able basically to travel back to Egypt via boat. They now have to deal with the more, traditional means of transportation, much more harsher, much more enduring. Again, just another one of the examples of the type of activities that they do. It's over. You have a ceasefire. Treat the enemy with respect. Absolutely not in this case, but they would later seize the area as well, as I mentioned. They would continue to demonstrate their air and naval superiority in this third phase, more so than the previous two. They would be almost unprecedented rulers of the sky, except for the British, which we are going to come to later. Gaza would now start being shelled by the Navy and aerial support during this period of time. So we're starting to see the bombardments and the attacks on Gaza. As we still see, the more things change, the more things remain the same, what they're still doing in that area to this day. And then they would launch Operation Har Har, which would be turning its attention to the small villages that surrounded Jerusalem. Because remember, in the original agreements, Jerusalem was to be an international city. It was to have municipalities ran by Arabs with Arab interest, for Zionists or Jews with Jewish interest. But they were not satisfied, obviously, with that. They did not want this to go under international. They wanted it themselves. So they began by just going around these small villages, picking them apart, one by one. On October 21st, they would capture Beersheba, take 120 Egyptians as their prisoners. The following day, they would take over the Egyptian flagship, Emir Farouk. They would basically destroy this with air and naval support. So Egypt has now lost its flagship. We talked about when I went before what happened in the armistice. We kind of jumped in time a little bit there just for context. But this is why they were able to so easily destroy the Egyptian Navy, because they took out their flagship. They were breaking them down months before and then ultimately destroyed them, not allowing those men I spoke of to get out. So what little resistance that was really left in the waters was now gone, and the Zionists were the unprecedented controllers of that. On November the 9th, the advancements would continue. Israel would launch Operation Shimon to capture the Tigart fort in Iraq, Sudan. This was an Arab village that was about 27 kilometers northeast of Gaza City. So it's again part of that continuing working on the villages. They had previously failed 8 attempts to capture this, fort, but they would finally succeed. And the Egyptian forces would give up and concede without a fight. 180 total Egyptians were dead. Would be taken as prisoner. And Egypt would remove all of its forces from the surrounding area. Iraq, Sudan would fall under more fierce fighting as they moved on from basically taking surrounding forts to take this out. And then you would have about a 6-day siege where they would ultimately take control of this strong point as well. On December 5th to 7th, they would further expand their invasion into Negev, and they would take out 100 Egyptians, taking control of the western side of Negev. And then 15 days later, Operation Horeb would come to further secure the area, and now, finally now, they had driven all Egyptians out of the area. So Negev is under control, no more enemy foes or combatants, and now they would begin their expansion there. So we already see Galilee, we now see Negev, we got Jerusalem in here. They're working their way around the surrounding cities. They've already bombarded Gaza, so they're just weakening everywhere, grabbing territory, and continuing the advancement. They would then launch raids into Nitzana and begin their invasion into the Sinai Peninsula on December the 28th. Their aim was to circle the entire Egyptian force, but however, first time we'd see this in the next coming months, they would have to pull out because the British had told them, you're going too far. Because they were starting to work their way, directly into the Sinai Peninsula area right there by Egypt. The British had had enough, told them to stop, or they were going to face a retaliatory set of strikes. So Israel reluctantly, against their best wishes, abandoned this plan. This was never, again, just stop here for a second. When you hear the narratives from the media, I talked about them almost in every episode, where it's little Israel, little David versus the big Goliath. And we always hear the stories about the Arabs have all this land and they want the tiny little land that the Jews have. And then you see the reality as this unfolded. How piece by piece, brick by brick, the Jews continued to take lands that were owned and occupied for thousands of years by other people, and didn't mind committing war crimes or any other atrocities to get such lands. It really goes against the mainstream narrative that we are constantly hearing. So now, after that had pretty much failed, that plan was gone. The IDF now would turn its attention and regroup at the border of the Gaza Strip. They surrounded the Egyptian forces to negotiate a ceasefire during this period of time. The Israelis would call foul and state that the Arabs could launch offensives with impunity, but when they did this, the United Nations would come in and stop them. So they're going in, they're surrounding Gaza, trying to, Egyptians are trying to get out of this. They're trying to get a ceasefire. The international community is trying to get a ceasefire. And the Israelis, as they always do, they're calling foul. They're saying that the international community is on the side of the Arabs and doesn't support them. And we hear this still to this day. They use it's reverse psychology. I remember when Barack Obama was the president, and you had all these Zionist leaders saying that Obama was an anti-Semitic president. And I remember laughing, like, does anyone honestly believe this? I mean, this could be refuted in 2 seconds. I mean, Obama gave them untold amounts of aid, just like everybody else has. But they want to create this doubt, in the mind that, oh, look, everybody's against little Israel over here. And again, we see it here. The United Nations was really against Israel. They would have sent troops in there, a peacekeeping force, and they would have given the boundaries of mandated Palestine under Article 22 of the League of Nations that was signed in the 1920s, and they would have given the Palestinians control of the land as originally pledged, with control of their own destiny. So again, the nerve of these people to cite a bias when the original intent of the land was to be mandated under British control and handed over to the authorities of Palestine to run and govern themselves, as we talked about in part 1 with Article 22. So they're here crying foul again, saying the whole world is against them because they're not allowing them to go in and slaughter civilians and take occupied territories that were never involved, in the conflict. By March 10th, however, they would finally secure southern Negev, raising the famous ink flag. This is a picture that's been immortalized in encyclopedias. When I was gathering information for this, I found that famous picture again was in the pages of the Encyclopedia Britannica. It shows the Israeli soldiers, kind of like what happened with the Americans in World War II. They're guiding the Israeli flag up. This is the famous date that they would do that. And they would basically declare that the war was officially over. And the Jewish state had the territory that it wanted for now, at least, and they declared victory by hoisting up that flag. So this part of the war was concluded. Phase 3 had gone on, but during that, I want to highlight something else that is related, but unrelated to the Arab-Israeli conflict directly, and that was the fighting between the Israelis and the British. This is something that when you hear mainstream narratives, we've already, in my opening today, we covered this. Killing Bernadotte, killing the French diplomat, King David Hotel, numerous bombing. They've done this before. And we are going to see where they use their military equipment now to do it again. So the Royal Air Force, the RFA of the British, would begin the third phase. So as the third phase was going on and the original stoppage agreements, truce, was taking place, the British were there for reconnaissance and peacekeeping. They were trying to keep an eye on what was going on. Understood how they knew, of course, of some of the Israeli advancements into the Sinai Peninsula that we talked about. So they had a stake in this. Not saying the British are these wholesome figures who just wanted peace. They had their own agenda, but they were non-combatants. So they would conduct these routine flights, sometimes going very low, trajectory, just trying to get a glimpse of what happened. And because Britain had still controlled Egypt at the time, some of these missions the Egyptians would go alongside as well, and you'd have British planes along with Egyptian planes side by side. The first shoot down, or first plane to be shot down, would occur on November 20th. An American volunteer named Wayne Peaks would strike first blood in this conflict by attacking a British fighter, killing both the pilot and the navigator. So ironically, it was an American mercenary, most likely, going over there training the Zionists who did first blood, here. On January 7th, Israelis would spot 4 aircraft flying at a very low altitude and began checking the scenes of a recent Israeli and Egyptian engagement, which was near the area known as Al-Bala. So these planes were coming in to try to see what had happened, about civilians being killed allegedly, and what was going on, how the combatants were treated. They were just trying to gather as much information as possible. Well, tank-mounted machine guns would shoot down one of the planes, fearing it was an Egyptian attack. Now, that was, again, what they said. Did they believe that or not? That's between Allah, subhanahu wa ta'ala, and them. But that was the official story. So now we have the second Royal British Air Force plane shot down. Later that day, 3 other pilots would be shot down. 2 were captured and interrogated by the Israeli soldiers who gotten them as they crashed. And they were later released, not tortured in this case. They actually were released. He was found by a Bedouin traveler in the desert, and he was taken basically to the Egyptian army, crossed the territory controlled by the Zionists, and he ultimately would be released, of course, back into British care. Several other battles had ensued, and David Ben-Gurion, first prime minister of Israel, what he would do here, he ordered the wrecks of these planes to be buried. He wanted all evidence covered. He wanted them to dig ditches, take whatever they could take, and bury the rest. He didn't want any future reconnaissance planes, which they didn't spot, to be able to see what exactly the Zionists were doing to a supposed peacekeeper, non-combatant, and ally. But the British reconnaissance would capture evidence of them burying these planes, and word got back to the Air Force Command. In fact, the pilots of the Royal Air Force were waiting in the cockpits for a major retaliation, because this was a violation of international law and codes of decency. They wanted a retaliation. They were ready to go. But as usual, the British commanders would say, no, stand down. We're not doing that. The only retaliation that the British would ever give to the Israelis for killing their men, shooting down their aircraft, was they did prevent the delivery of some fuel and supplies during a short period of time. It's almost like top command knew where the orders came from, knew who buttered the bread, but he was like, okay, I'm just speculating here, but this is what it sounds like to a mind who's pondering this, was, okay, let's just do something. We can't not do anything, so let's at least pretend that we're doing something where this should have been a declaration of war. We would see years later the Israelis attack the USS Liberty, American ship, with the attempt to sink it. And also, again, nothing would happen. There would be zero retaliation. We saw Israelis later in the 1970s in the Lavon affair. They were trying to kill British and American diplomats in Egypt. And guess what? Blame it on the Arabs again. The Muslim terrorists did this, trying to bait the United States into further involvement. This was exposed. Did anything happen? Of course not. So it's just the more things change, the more they remain the same. Same thing went on here with the British. We don't see any ounce of retaliation from them. Now we would move on to the armistice agreements I talked about that had been forced earlier on with the Egyptians. In February 24th, 1949, this is where this would begin. Israel and Egypt would sign their first agreement. Lebanon would follow in March 23rd, Transjordan on April 3rd, and Syria on July the 20th. So now there would be an armistice agreement, no more fighting, and then, of course, the new boundaries would be designed and drawn, called the Green Lines, We will talk about this right now in a minute so you can just kind of see how much has transferred during this last year, starting with the Palestinian Civil War all the way up into these phases. So three quarters, over 75%, it's about 78% actually, but I mentioned three quarters because that's rounded off, obviously, to the easiest number, but about 78 to 79% of the original mandated Palestine was now basically given to the Zionists. And that was, as I mentioned in foreshadowing in parts 1, 2, and 3, that was always the plan, wasn't it? When they signed the Balfour Declaration, the Sykes-Picot agreements, it was always the plan. They always knew how much they were going to take, how much they wanted. Jerusalem still sat there. They still coveted that, but they knew all along. That's why they were unleashing the immigration waves we saw in the 20s that would intensify in the 40s. This is why immigration was such a hot button issue in negotiations between the two sides. The British White Paper of 1938, 1939, we saw them trying to curb this immigration. We saw all the money that they were raising over the tours to build weapons, to train these new immigrants. They knew all along what the ultimate goal was. They just needed the Arabs to take the bait and fight them. And sure enough, the Arabs did take that bait. They fought them. And now they had 78% of the original mandated land. Land under a Class A mandate that was going to be under the control of the Palestinian people. The Gaza Strip and the West Bank would still be, as we pretty much see today, but we'll get to how that changed later on in other videos, would be occupied by Transjordan, would take basically the Gaza Strip, and Egypt would take control of the West Bank. Right before this agreement, there was a plan, however, to conquer the West Bank. But Ben-Gurion refused, and we talked about that earlier. They wanted this. They had felt they had the men to do it. They didn't want to absorb the Arab population, as I highlighted. So what their plan was here was simply to go in there and just kill them all and make the rest run. And Ben-Gurion stopped it because he felt he would have to deal with the British and other Western nations. It would be a huge black eye, for Israel. So to sum up the conflict, Israel would lose 6,373 of its population. This was about 1% of their levels at the time. Out of that, 4,000 were soldiers, 2,373 were civilians. The amount of Arab deaths, though, is highly disputed and really largely unknown. We'll cover the why. Some people have it as 7,000, with 3K Palestinians, 2K Egyptian, 1K Jordanian, and 1K Syrian. Those numbers are by far too general. They're too rounded off, if you will. Much more were lost when you count in civilians and you count in the people who died trying to migrate in the heat. We talked about some of those stories in the last episode. But some have cited as high as 13,000. As I always said, I try to typically take the middle, between the two positions. I would probably say 10,000 to 13,000 is much more likely than the 7,000 general figure. And one of the reasons for that was a lot of these Arab villages, they were very small, and they didn't have advanced record keeping. This is still looking at a period in 1948. I mean, there wasn't no flash drive, there was no floppy disks, there were no computers, there was none of those things. I mean, record keeping was done in file cabinets, the old-fashioned way with a typewriter. And it's safe to say that birth records, death certificates, and these things were not widely kept. Also, you had these cities and villages being completely destroyed. So if there were records there, you wouldn't find them. As an example, my wife's parents, they don't exactly know their birth date. They were born in Palestinian refugee camps, and they know around this date, but no one really knows for certain when they were even born. So you have a lot of that aspect there. But most agree on both sides, people who take the more conservative number and the more liberal number, that the majority of the Palestinian deaths were civilians. Where we saw the Israelis, the majority, about 70%, were soldiers, where on the other side it was more civilians by far. During the war, 750,000, I mentioned this number earlier, that either fled or were expelled from their homes. This would become famously known in the Arab world as the Nakba, the tragedy, the genocide, and displacement. There would be approximately 1.2 million in the Palestinian territories of the mandated. So if you think about that, there's 1.2 million in the mandated, British mandated Palestinian territory, and 750,000 are gone. They fled. So, I mean, you're losing over half your population, while at the same time, we're going to see the numbers on the other side just continue to increase. And also, these figures, to point in another note, they did not include either the displaced Palestinians who were living in territories which were controlled by the Jewish state. Those numbers are very shoddy. Jewish state controlled it. They controlled the records. No one knows who was killed, who was forced out. It's really not able to really be determined. Through all these years, still no numbers really exist on that. 156,000 will remain, however, and they would become citizens, second-class citizens of these occupied Jewish territories. So the ones we talked about them earlier that had the peace deals, they could stay. They became citizens, albeit second-class citizens. Now, this is where one of the haunting things of this conflict that we still live in today. Displaced Palestinians will be held in refugee camps throughout the Arab world. Any Arab nations refused, and still to this day, refuse to give them residency or nationality and insist it's for their own good and they be allowed to return. I've heard those firsthand. I've had members of GCC countries telling me we'll never give those people citizenship because we love them, because we want them to go back. So you want them to go back, we all do. But in the meantime, let's treat them as second-class citizens and not allow them to work certain jobs. Let's not allow them to do this, not allowed to do anything pretty much except for work a low-level job. And that's brotherhood? Well, if that's brotherhood, I don't want it. And I've heard that excuse has been peddled by the governments. The people on the ground level believe it, that this is for their own good, that we're not giving them nationality, because we're going to guarantee their right to return. So in the meantime, they're just going to be second-class citizens in our country. And the Palestinians would be issued over time what they call Palestinian travel documents. And, my wife had one, was Palestinian Syrian travel documents. Some had Palestinian Lebanese travel documents. Some had Egyptian, and some had Jordanian. Syria by far was the best when it came to giving these people the rights, opposed to what they would see in Egypt and Lebanon. Jordan did give some of them nationality. I have cousins on that side of the family who received it, this way. And you have very interesting situations that arise in the Arab world, because as an example, a couple that I knew, the husband had Palestinian Lebanese documents, while she had Palestinian Syrian documents. They were not allowed to go to Syria together to see her family during a time Syria was not letting those people in, so to speak. So, I mean, you have a married couple, husband and wife, and they are not allowed even to enter the country of the wife's family to visit because of this nonsense. And it's still prevalent today. This is the unity that the Muslim world has. It is just beyond, it's just beyond thought. I mean, really, to think about it. But it was all for their own good, as they said. So while all this exodus was going on, we had, from 1948 to 1951, we had 700,000 more Jews enter the Jewish state. 750,000 Palestinians gone, 700,000 more Jews to take their place. The Jewish Agency, who we talked about off and on throughout several episodes of this, they were responsible for facilitating, organizing, providing all the coordination of these immigrations to get these people in free of charge, provide for all their expenses, all their travels. So they would get migrants from Iraq, the North African region, Asia, and of course, as well, a lot from Europe. But during this period of time, you would see a lot coming from former, Muslim-controlled countries is a better word for it, because Arab governments were starting to harshly treat the Zionists or the Jews in general for this, sometimes warranted, sometimes unwarranted, obviously. So a lot of the Jews wanted to get out and get to Israel as fast as possible. And this would lead to another 800,000 to 1 million leaving, which 650,000 of that would be settling in Israel. This would be over the course of time. So even more. So now you've got a juggernaut, a military machine. You've got a large population. The foundations are in place. A new nation was born. They've got their iconic moment of them raising the flag, declaring the end on March the 10th. Now they want to get basically in the United Nations. They want to continue to be recognized as this sovereign state. But before that, we have UN Resolution 194. Both the Israelis and the Arabs would initially reject this proposal. The Arabs' position had always stayed the same. We are not here to negotiate what was internationally, legally promised to us. We're not taking concessions. We're here for the whole thing that was given to us. And that was why, of course, the Arabs would always reject such proposals. The main goal of Resolution 194 was to facilitate peace and to bring the Palestinian refugees back into the territories. Israel believed that it's under no obligation to let any refugees return, nor return any abandoned or seized properties. Again, they already had the legislation in place. Why would they? So Israel, of course, outright refused this, stating, no way we're giving back territories, no way we're going to allow any of those people to be brought into territories that we've claimed or territories that we originally already had. So the UN General Assembly under Article 4, Rule 125, decided that Israel was a peace-loving nation. And I used to chuckle when I was in my early 20s, and I would see George Bush, on camera. And he would always say that Netanyahu was a man of peace. I mean, it's one of those things, I don't know how he was able even to say it without laughing, because just saying it sounds so absurd. It's funny when you look at the track record of this gang, these clowns, if you will, what they've done. And when you issue statements like this coming from the United Nations, they're a peace-loving nation. After they attacked diplomats, assassinated the head of the UN to facilitate peace in the region, killed the British diplomat, blew up the King David Hotel, shot down British aircraft, stole British munitions, targeted British civilians to blame it on Arabs, set up sniper ambushes. It goes on and on and on. And you're saying this is a peace-loving nation? And then they would say also in those statements that America was a peace-loving nation as well, which is even almost equally as funny to say such a statement as me and Sister Layla were talking about before the session tonight. So Israel would be admitted into the UN in May on the condition that they accept the obligation under the UN Charter. But Israel did not comply, no surprise there, with the right to return that was outlined in the Charter. They sign it, they get in. Sorry, guys, we're not going to follow that refugee thing. Have a nice day. And of course, was anything ever going to be done? I think we still have the history in the modern day world as an example that just simply wasn't the case. But the Provisional Council would state, any law applying to the whole state of Israel shall be deemed to apply to the whole of the area, including the area of the state of Israel and any part of Palestine which the Minister of Defense has defined by proclamation as being held by the army of Israel. So right here, they're saying they're recognizing the Zionist ambitions that they had signed back in September of 48 of not giving the territories back. Here it is in the UN. All the laws apply to the whole state of Israel, as well as the territories which they control. Any person or bodies of persons competent by virtue of a law as aforesaid to hold office or act in the whole of the state of Israel shall be deemed to be competent to hold office or act in the whole of the area, including both the area that state of Israel controls militarily or already recognized as the part, to cut that quote short. So here, if someone's deemed competent as authority in Israel, someone can be a representative across, government official, hold office, doesn't matter. Basically stating these territories under legislation and judicial belong to Israel as well. This ordinance shall have effect retroactively as from the 6th 57, or sorry, they were using the Jewish year there. I got confused. I had the quote taken out of the encyclopedia. Be the 15th of May in our term, 1948. And all acts done which, but for the provision of this ordinance, should be without effect are hereby validated retroactively. So it's done, all acts done, all things under the ordinance, all now law abiding. Israel has total control of these territories. They would not be questioned on it, no force or pressure to give it back. Their legal authorities can rule throughout the territories equally. There was no distinction pretty much at this point in time between Israeli control by military force or actually part of this newfound Jewish state. So they've got everything. The year before, they were recognized by 11 minutes by the United States. 1 year later, they're recognized by the UN. The first thing they sign to get in the UN, they violate. And then what does the UN do? They issue a condemnation. They come out with this, basically adhering to their demands, acknowledging their internal policies, and giving them everything that they wanted. And as we know, they're not done yet. So as we wrap up part 4 here, we saw, again, massive land expansion, massive migration. The new phenomenon of the Palestinian refugee was born. Palestinians would forever hold residence in places like Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Egypt. They would flee looking for jobs around the Gulf. They became a people without a home, without a passport, with travel documents, where they were mistreated, treated like second-class citizens in the vast majority of these places. We saw the Arab army totally vanquished, driven out, 78% of the land now in Zionist hands. The movement was continuing. And in part 5, we're going to start getting up as the years are going to go by a lot faster. Less happened in the 1950s and the 1960s until we get to 1967. So you're going to see just a few minor things we're going to cover there in part 6. And then we are going to get to the 67, conflict, the 71 conflict. And we're going to see again the further expansion, the further dominance of the Zionist state, and more death, more and more destruction. And of course, we're still seeing it today. So, Sister Layla, I'm going to close here on that final note. And she's got the map up, of course, conveniently there to be able to see where we were.
Yeah, we got to see the I showed the did you all get to see the flag, the ink flag too? Yeah, I posted that up too for them to see. You didn't see it because you were, weren't looking. But that ink flag, subhanAllah, I see what you meant. Let me see if I can put it back up again.
Yeah, I have my bullet points up.
Yeah,
just to keep me on focus.
That's good. That's good.
Don't jump around too much. So I didn't see when you put it up.
Yeah, but I put that up because subhanAllah, it does look just like that American.
Oh yeah.
What was that? Japan or something? America was fighting. I don't know what they were fighting when they put that little flag up in America.
Yeah, it was over in the Eastern Theater of World War II. Yeah, America was fighting Japan and China.
It's on my computer. I just got my computer. This is the laptop. I don't know where I put it at on here. But they got to see it. I had the flag up, the ink flag.
Yeah, it was good to put the territories up as well, just so we can see when you talk about these places like Upper Galilee and Lebanon and Negev, and you see just how big these areas were. And all of them were originally going and mandated Palestine. These are Palestinian lands. Now they were in the hands of Zionists.
Okay, you got a few questions here. Let me look at the first one. Brother Ahmad, he said, I have a question. What role did crusaders play in Jerusalem? I know about Salahu ad-Din.
Well, yeah, we can do some stuff on that in the future. The Crusaders basically largely comprised of French, led by the Pope. Now, there's, as Muslims, we have to understand, we're not always right. We have some pretty bad leaders as well. And a lot of the actions of the Crusades were prompted by certain Turkish groups and things that they were doing to Christians, which are un-Islamic. Granted, the Crusades went on. They committed tons of merciless bloodshed, and they were horrible and must be condemned because they killed everything that moved. They didn't go into the Jerusalem and just say, okay, let's kill the soldiers and leave everybody. They killed women, children, it didn't matter. So their conduct is horrific. But they were provoked, and there was a lot of things that Muslim groups, particularly Turkish groups, were doing to Christians that is not Islamic, not in the behavior of the messenger of Allah, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or the companions. But yeah, we can eventually go into detail here and cover the Crusades. Go over like what actually went on. There's more than one of them, several attempts, and of course liberated later on back by the Muslims. Saladin, as he mentioned, was a key figure in this.
Okay, another question. Jamila says, let me put her question so I can read it. She says, during the 70s, did the Israelis build a wall between themselves to separate the Palestinians?
Yeah, we're going to start covering that, the settlements and the walls and the fortresses that started being built there. You see walls all throughout Israel surrounding these Arab territories. It's like keeping them in a camp, basically. And we're going to start covering as the settlements start getting, because now where we're at here, we've just seen, they're just doing the blueprint right now. They're just carving up what's going to be theirs. But we're going to see now as it escalates, we've got clear borders now being defined for the first time in the conflict. And as these borders start to shrink, the Israeli settlements start to grow, and you're going to see those walls and all the other things coming up, which is they use it as a guise of protection. An American taxpayer ironically pays for all these walls they've got erected around. Our government tells us we can't stop Venezuelan drug dealers from coming into the country and committing all kinds of crime and MS-13 gang members. We can't build a wall. We don't have no money, but we built all of Israel, And we're going to, yes, for the sister, we're going to be going into all of that as we build up increment by increment, how this machine got built, one brick at a time.
Another question. The brother here says, what they did to Britain, he said, subhanAllah, how is it that they still supported them?
Oh, yeah. And that's the kind of theme I've been trying to convey off and on throughout this series. We saw it all throughout the Mandate period. I named all the attacks in rapid way just to kind of make them seem as big as they really were. But I mean, bombing British military headquarters in the King David Hotel, using snipers to attack British people and peacekeepers and police on the road, stealing military equipment. I mean, you imagine, like if any other nation had done this, you would have had the United States, you'd have France, you'd have all the usual suspects, would have been in there. They would have been calling them all kinds of names. They're terrorists. We got to get the terrorists. But the Zionists do it, no problem. It's okay. And the Levant affair in the 70s, I think 71, when I talked about that, when they were killing the British and American diplomats in Egypt, and they were going to blame it on the Arabs, and they got caught. And then the USS Liberty. And when 9/11 happened, that staged, circus and theater there. Benjamin Netanyahu was on American television. He said he was happy for this because he said America can understand, what Arabs are like and what they have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. So, I mean, this is supposedly our best friend, our ally. We always keep hearing that if Israel falls, the whole Middle East will go and we have to save them. They're our greatest ally, but they never tell you why or how they became that way. Israel hasn't given $1 to the United States. I remember, when we had hurricane relief, one of those massive ones, they hit Florida. We had people from Iraq giving money. We had people from Singapore giving money. We had people from Japan. People from all over the world were donating aid money for the people who lost their homes and had no power and food. Israel didn't give $1. I mean, it wasn't even $1. I mean, they give this country literally zero. And they take our resources. They privatize all of our natural resources and make money off selling us our own stuff. And then, of course, they take our tax dollars in the tune of billions annually. And we get nothing in return for that but an ally who comes on TV and says he's glad 3,400 or whatever it was Americans, at least 3,450, somewhere around there, Americans died. It's a good thing.
Sad. Another question here. Why country like USA, UK, Italy support Israel? Even the Christians in Israel are treated very badly. I don't think Jews believe in Jesus, which we do. So why do they support him?
Absolutely, a brilliant question. Lord Rothschild famously said, Moses Amschel Bauer, who changed his name to Mayor Rothschild, he said, I care not, who runs a country. Sorry, give me control of the currency, and I care not who makes the laws. something to that effect. I had that quote used to memorize. I haven't used it in a while, but let me control the currency and I care not who basically prints the law or makes the laws or something to that effect, he said. And the Zionists, from Nathan Rothschild, when he took over the London Stock Exchange in the early 1820s, all the way to the Federal Reserve System here in the United States, what they do is they establish central banks in the country, and they use their paper money scam. And because they have that ability to print money endlessly, that's not backed by anything, it all started with what we call fractional reserve lending, which meant if you gave a bank $100 deposit, they could loan out $1,000 off of your $100 and be insured against for that. And this allowed them to accumulate massive amounts of wealth through the interest, the riba that they were charging. And they used this currency to buy up politicians because they love democracy. As Sister Layla was saying in the opening before we came live, we were talking about democracy and what a sham it is. They love democracy so much because it's a lot easier to buy 150 politicians than it is to buy one king. They prefer democracy. It's very easy for them to manipulate. So they control your banks, they control your money supply. Through that, they buy the politicians, they buy the politicians' votes. We don't have representative government. Our representatives don't represent us in any shape, way, or form. They represent who pays them money. That's why every single one of them, I talked about it in my voting lesson that I did. They come in there, they make $150,000 salary. They leave Congress, they got $20 million in the bank. It's statistically impossible, unless, of course, they're getting kickbacks, bribes, stock tips, and so on. So through paper money, it's the biggest weapon of the Zionists. It allowed them to buy the newspapers. It allowed them to take control of basically the sports leagues. It's allowed them to take control of all the entertainment that we see. Every piece of information was filtered. Internet has saved us from this for now. That's why they want to censor it so bad. Before the internet, it was very hard to find the truth. You had to go to libraries and really dig, if the library even carried, a lot of books, which they didn't. The Zionists had perfect control over all information that we received during that time. So to answer the brother's question, a big loaded issue, it's through paper money, and it's through their control of the banks.
Yep. And George Washington were all for it. Oh, yeah. That
well, Lincoln tried to stop it, and they put a bullet in the back of his head.
That sure did.
He was going to go with the greenbacks that were going to be backed by gold, secured notes, printed by the Treasury Department, and then burned after war to keep the inflation down. And they put a bullet in his head.
Yeah,
they put a bullet in Kennedy's head also because Kennedy wanted to audit the Federal Reserve Bank.
Yes, he did.
And that was his final straw. They took him out.
Yeah, America's history.
Well, that's why I tell people this phony assassination attempt on Trump, when they want to get you, they're going to get you. You're not going to escape. If they wanted Trump, they would have gotten him. It was all staged. The whole thing was phony. I've dealt with treating blood. I was a certified first aider for 14 years. That wasn't no bullet wound. That wasn't no fragment. That was phony blood.
Yes, you could tell too, couldn't you? Yep.
Yeah, exactly.
I think everybody saw that.
I've had to treat guys with metal gashes from metal strips of aluminum all the way down their arm. And I watched it live, and I looked at my wife. I said, "This is such theater." Yeah. And the way he got up and did the fight.
Did you see that? That was so funny. It was hilarious. He's a good actor. That's for darn sure.
Totally. I mean, Secret Service never would allow you to stand up after gunshots had been fired until they completely combed the area, secured it. It violates every safety protocol known to man.
Yeah, that was
when they got Kennedy, they had at least 4 teams. It was triangulation of crossfire. Guys were missing a lot that day because I'm sure the stress. Mm-hmm. But we have guys missing, backfiring. The one guy under the underpass got nicked by a fragment that ricocheted off the concrete. Guys were scared. They're going to kill the president. Yeah. And they were missing, but there was enough guns on them that eventually they would get the kill shot. When these people want you, they're going to get you. And Kennedy was the last one who dared to say the word audit the Fed, who had power to do it.
He sure did. And that's what they did to him. Yep. Yeah.
And get away with it.
Yep. Yeah, these are all the questions I had here. What about Zoom? You guys can go now in Zoom. These were great questions, guys. And the brother said, Subhana Allah, this makes sense. Subhana Allah. Yes, it does. Okay, another person's typing, I really enjoyed this class. May Allah bless you, brother, for the time that you put into this. This is making things so much clearer.
Thank you. I hope I didn't bore a lot of the ladies with the military talk, the northern theater.
I threw in the pictures to try to liven it up.
Yeah, because it's like you start, but you have to cover it because we have to know how they were able to get it, how it all transpired. But we're pretty much done with military talk. We're going to be going back to negotiations, and more wars are coming, unfortunately. But there will be less of that, in the next one. But try to make it as entertaining as possible to keep the information, there for people who need to know how this whole thing went. Because in order to get step 10, you got to know 2, 3, 4, and so on. And we're talking about with the brother's question again about making sense with the money. When we start covering in here the entertainment industry as well, and we see how they control that, all the dots start connecting. And you start understanding that everything about this reality is contrived, it's all planned. All those people you see on TV who they tell you, oh, he came from nothing. He was a guy with a dream and a guitar. And then you dig in his background, you find his father was military intelligence. You see that his dad worked for the CIA, was down in Cuba during it's
Another brother here types, he said, why is it that Egypt was the only country trying to help?
Well, we talked about this a little bit in the past, that I questioned the loyalty of Abdullah. The Syrians fought. The Syrians, they just were not powerful enough. The Syrians were also there, but King Abdullah just wanted land, and he was basically one of those guys. He was a puppet of the British. He was there for his own interests. He wanted to be wealthy, have his territory. He sabotaged the initial Arab effort, which we covered in the last part, because the original Arab effort of the simultaneous attacks would have thinned the Zionists out, and they would have been fighting a 3-front war at the same time. This plan was abandoned. So King Abdullah of Jordan, has a lot to do with this. And, he seems to me to be a little bit of a malicious actor, if you will. And granted, there's no documentation. That's just mere speculation on my part. But his actions and how he got the power, it all leads me to believe that.
Mm-hmm.
And the way his family still is to this day.
To this day. I was going to say that. That's the way they are to this day. Okay, another brother here. He said, I am an older brother. He said, and I can remember the later wars there. He said, did Anwar Sadat ever support, who is this? Abdullah, I think he's saying, the king.
That's Sister Layla's uncle there.
Yeah, he know, but no, but yeah, answer his question. Oh, yeah.
We're going to cover that in the next part. Anwar Sadat will be mentioned. I've got to freshen up on the research as I do on Saturdays and Sundays and Mondays. We will be going into detail on that. I just don't want to say anything incorrect or wrong. But in the next part, he's going to come into the picture, and we are going to explore the conflict from basically the 1950s all the way up until, should be middle of the 70s, I believe. Next part, we will see as I go back through the databases and comb the information. But I'll answer that question next week because I'm going to back in and research all this stuff in a little bit more detail. So I don't want to say anything incorrect.
He said he's typing now. He said, what I mean was, since his English is bad. I don't think English is his first language. He said, since the Jordan didn't do much to help, I guess that's what he's saying.
Oh, yeah.
Did Egypt and Syria have a good relationship with Jordan? That's what I think he's asking.
And Jordan is, it's a fake country, for starters. It was given to them, so we talked about this in part 1, where the family basically was controlling Mecca at the time. They wanted the Saudis to take control of this. So they got him to agitate basically Arabs against the Turks. And then in turn, he would be rewarded. And he got his reward. The Saudis got control of Mecca and Medina. The rest is history, unfortunately, on that. And of course, he got his Hashemite kingdom of Jordan.
Right.
And they've been basically a British-Israeli puppet ever since.
That's true. Yeah. He said, he typed, I cannot wait. Thank you so much.
It will unravel all that, as we're going to get into, because I will be doing some videos later after this series. We have a couple series planned, but I want to cover also the emergence of the Saudi state as it all relates to this. Because I saw a brother on Twitter the other day. He said something that was just so one line of the truth. He said, the Arabs could stop this tomorrow if they wanted. Oil embargo. And I mean, it's just
That's
straight
the
to the
truth.
point, bang.
Yep.
You know, this whole thing would have stopped on October the 8th if those countries would do what they have the power to do.
Mm-hmm. And throw in the Muslim African countries too, because they have the natural gas and the other resources that the world needs.
Yep.
If all these Muslim countries would band together instead of fighting and hating on each other, we would be the superpower of the world, because we have the resources that the rest of the world needs.
Yeah, and they decided along the way that if you want to rule black faces, you need to get a black face that works for you to rule them. That it was much more effective than if you had a white face or a brown face to rule over a people that didn't look like them. They would identify. And we started seeing the other type of colonialism, which is what you see now, where you have a Saudi guy, he's wearing the gutra, he's got his thing on, he's wearing the fob, he has a name like you, looks like you, talks like you. It's so much better to control a population with that approach than to have a British guy with a suit and a tie speaking to the Saudi population.
Exactly. Exactly. Subhanallah. Okay, any questions in Zoom? Go ahead.
I do. What I would like to know, I mean, this is crucial. This information is crucial for like I believe I said before. And is there a way that this information is being documentation of this information that can be preserved so that it won't be covered up or disposed of like many of the information of the past?
Well, absolutely. It's very crucial. And right now, this information, you can find it in British encyclopedias, American encyclopedias. Wikipedia does a phenomenal job. I took a lot of my sequences actually from Wikipedia, and then I researched the points that they had there in other more reliable sources. But Wikipedia gets a bad rap, but they do have a lot of good information, there that can be found. And why it's all still open, because as you mentioned, we saw during COVID how they could take control of the censor switch, and you had doctors and people with PhDs of 50 years in medicine being censored, and their works being buried to the public who conflicted the official narratives on COVID-19. So we've seen them use the censorship weapon recently. And as time goes by, it's going to be harder and harder, I think, as they're trying to get control of the internet to basically find the truth. The internet opened it up. Like I said, when I was growing up, you had to go down to the public library, and you were at the mercy, or the school library in the college, and you were at the mercy of their bookstore to find information. But now, I mean, you can find so much stuff, on the internet. Now you have another dilemma, though, that goes with that is verifying the information is true. But the information is definitely readily available at this point to the public. And yes, I encourage everyone to go out there and read, because I'm giving you shorter, entertaining versions of this to make it easier to follow. But you can find as detailed as you want to go or as simple as you want to go on the internet. Just got to make sure, though, that it's authentic, because you do have a lot of, especially social media is a horrible source to get information these days. You'll have guys now with AI. They're posting a video and this is the truth, and they'll have a quote on it. The guy never even said it, when you go and look it up. So we got to be careful.
All right, that seems like it's going to be a mission on its own,
Yeah, we still got time. I mean, in Europe, the censorship is horrific. You can go to jail for questioning the Holocaust. I mean, in Europe. Here in America, we still have freedom. I do say a lot of things about my government. One thing they haven't been able to take from me yet is my freedom of speech. They try to get you fired from your jobs. They try to do other things to you, but they still can't stop your right to say something. And when it comes to free speech, it extends to books and the press. But they can make it harder to find. And they have done that. There is a big difference now between what Google was in 2005 and what Google is in 2024. Yes. Big difference. They censor so much that you try to do a simple search, you can't even find things that you could find easily 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that's all we got. Alhamdulillah. This was a good class. Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah.
Let me come on here. Okay, guys. Well, mashallah, this was a very good session, as you all are typing here. And yes, this class is every Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So make sure that you guys join next Friday so we can continue on with what is part 6, I believe, of the history.
Layla, can we move it to 8 next week? Because it's starting to be Maghrib now, so I'm thinking it'd be better for everybody. But I have a company function also, but going forward, I think 8 o'clock would be better because of Maghrib time.
Let me write that down. That's fine. Let me write it 8 p.m.
Yeah, because that's what we were doing when we started in the winter. We were coming right to like Maghrib, or when Isha gets really early, we can do it after Isha, and it's even better. When Isha starts being at like 7 o'clock.
Oh, yeah. Okay, yeah, we'll do it. I'll put that down, a note for that now. Yeah, so that'll be 8 p.m. starting next Friday. And we'll continue with part 6 of this journey, guys. And again, please spread this information. Please share the videos, the shorts that I put out. Please share them with the people on your Facebook and social media programs so people can learn the history. And this is true. This is in the books. This stuff is in the books. So it all is authentic. Okay, it's the history. So please share it so the Muslims can become educated. All right, and so I'm going to close out for now. Inshallah, make sure you guys join back at 9:30. That's when I'm having the Islam Q&A. The Islam Q&A is at 9:30 Eastern Standard Time. So, subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik. Assalamu alaikum, everyone.
Alaikum